we have Israelis bombing Iranian consulate in Syria. In your opinion, what's the reason behind this type of bombing on the part of Israelis?
What we're seeing now are some more overt attempts by Bibi Netanyahu to drag the United States into the war. That's an act of war, not just an act of war kinetic. That's an act of war by international law when you attack the sovereign territory of another nation, and a consulate or an embassy is sovereign territory. I guarantee you, if someone dropped bombs on our embassy or consulate in some country, we would drop bombs back on them. Iran has to be a little more circumspect, and they have been, surprisingly in some ways, but not if you think about it strategically. They have been very circumspect in the way they've responded. They even have called their militias in Syria and Iraq off for the moment. I don't think they'll take this one, though. I think we'll see some sort of asymmetrical response somewhere along the line. Could come in a few days, it could come in a few weeks, but it will happen. And Israel is looking for something a little more precipitous. Bibi Netanyahu wants a wider war. He wants to pick on Hezbollah until Hezbollah feels like it has no chance but to respond majorly. They don't want to, and Iran does not want them to either. But Nasrallah makes his own decisions, and if he takes enough casualties and is beaten up badly enough, and that includes Lebanon too, he's going to have pressure on him from certain Lebanese who don't want to get their country any further in a mess than it already is. So he's got pressure on him to respond. And as you're seeing, he's already responding with more ordnance than he has in the past, and more sophisticated ordnance. And now you've got the attack on the consulate in Syria. So Bibi is working. He's working. We know the polls right now show that if Benny Gantz ran against him, which Benny wants to, he would wipe him out. He's way ahead in the polls, and he's called for elections in September. Bibi has said no, he doesn't want him in September. Well, he doesn't want him in September because he knows he'd get wiped out, and then he'd go to jail probably. So he is going to seek every opportunity to widen this war, to bring the United States in to do his heavy lifting for him that he can find. And I'm not that confident that this team in Washington is smart enough to not take the bait.
One of the important players in this conflict would be Turkey. We know Erdogan was playing both sides of this conflict in some ways, but we know the public opinion in Turkey is totally against Israel.
Erdogan has got himself now in a pickle, a political pickle, because he took a shellacking in Istanbul, but across the country, his party took a shellacking. So, and the polls are not looking good for Erdogan. So he's been saying all these bellicose things to his legislature in order to try and increase his ratings in the polls, not intending to follow up on any of it, I don't think, other than the strategic moves he's made with the Port of Alexandria, southern tip of Gaza, got him some territory on the Red Sea now and such, which are very subtle strategic moves. But he's in trouble politically. And the people know. I was looking at a poll yesterday as to how many of the Turkish people, Kurds, otherwise, who are now voting for the same party that the gentleman in Istanbul represents and really trounced the AKP. The polls are showing the Turkish people know that Turkey's still sending oil and food to Israel. So they know that Erdogan's been talking out of both sides of his mouth. He's been sending oil and food to Israel. At the same time, he's been condemning Netanyahu as a terrorist. So they know it's all political. That's going to hurt him. So is he going to do something now more concrete with respect to Israel because he needs a political rise in the polls? I don't know, but this could be another ingredient in this regional tapestry that draws us into a bigger and wider war.
Do you think that Israelis would continue attacking Iranian targets in that region, or they're going to stop it?
I think they'll continue. I think as long as Netanyahu is the commander-in-chief, and many people don't understand the way Israel goes to war. It's the way Israel conducts its business in non-wartime. I won't say peace, because Israel, since 1948, has never been interested in peace. and thus has not achieved peace. It's been in a wartime state since 1948. So the way they have it designed, no constitution, very purposeful, that act of having no constitution, because the Knesset is all powerful and the prime minister is all powerful within that Knesset because there's no constitution to keep him in check. Nothing to go back to and say, is this legal? Is this right? Or whatever. The only thing checking them was a very robust and dynamic Supreme Court. It no longer is that, although it does have Netanyahu under indictment. So it can do anything it wants to in this semi-war state that it's in with no constitution. So what we're going to see here is we're going to see Israel seeking more and more war in order to sustain itself. Joseph Abasar said the other day something very astute. I've listened to a couple of Orthodox rabbis say these things, but Joseph is a Jewish American lawyer in Los Angeles. And he said, Israel's purpose is war. Think about it for a moment. The only way a Jewish state can have existence is to have a constant threat that it plays up to its people, plays up to its allies and friends, and brings everything to bear on that threat 24/7. That's the only way it can exist. That's the reason Joseph says the most dangerous thing for Israel, the state of Israel, is to be a Jewish state. It needs to be a democracy. It needs to have a constitution. It needs to have a plurality. They all need to have some power, political and otherwise. Otherwise, you are going to have to stay at war forever. And I think Joseph's right.
The other thing would be how much Iranian government would be patient with these attacks. If something happens between Iran and Israel, how do you find the Iranian army? Do you think Israel without the United States can sustain such a war?
I do not. The Iranian army is very small. The Iranian Navy is very small. The Iranian military, as a military, is very small. Now, the Republican Guard is a different entity. It's not that much bigger, but it's better trained, and it's probably got the best of the Iranian youth in it in terms of soldiers and fighting. But it's not a home defense force, as it were. It's a let's go out and train others to do our work for us in the region. And that's what it's been doing. Of course, it was doing it par excellence under the gentleman we killed in Iraq. But they're doing a pretty good job of it still. They're spreading their influence by training basically Shia militias across the region. So you put all of that together, the IRGC and the standard national military of Iran, it's not very formidable. But 90 million people situated in the terrain that they are situated in the region that they're situated, is a formidable target to try and take on. Ask Saddam Hussein, who attacked them thinking, oh, this will be over very quickly. And before he knew it, they were at the doors of Baghdad. They're very formidable when they get aroused and they get all their people under a draft conscription system and they go to war. Then they're formidable. And that's what we would have to face if we were to invade them. And it would take a lot, very lot to do that. I'm worried. I'm really worried because I was in on the negotiations for almost 10 years for the JCPOA and what preceded it. And I know that when they operationalized, and that was their term, their foreign minister looked at me in New York and said, can I use that English term? It doesn't translate very well in Farsi, but I'm going to use it. We will operationalize this fatwa, if you want us to, that says Islam abominates a nuclear weapon. We will never develop a nuclear weapon. I believe that man at the time. I think he was being sincere. I'm afraid that this situation that Israel is provoking and will continue to provoke is going to cause the other element in Iran, as it were, to gain ascendancy, especially within the Guardian Council and with the Ayatollah, and maybe the new one too, and wind up making a decision to make a bomb. And we will have compelled it. Bibi will have compelled it, and we will have let him do it. And that's a very dangerous situation.
At the end of the day, what would be the result for Israelis?
the result they're seeking is precisely what I said. They want a wider war. They want Iran to respond and to respond in a blatant sort of fashion. But don't ask me about killing people. I mean, when they can put a drone over a food convoy and follow that food convoy and fire again and again and again at that food convoy until they get it and kill some people who are innocent people trying to bring food to starving Gazans, they can do anything. I no longer have any respect for the Israeli Defense Force. As far as I'm concerned, they are a gang of butchers.
Do you think this was a mistake on the part of Israeli army, or they deliberately attacked this car, these people who were helping Gazans, who were feeding Gazans?
I think what you have happening here, and I've seen it with my own military. When you, at the top echelons of command, and in this case, we're talking about the prime minister, that's the way Israel works. We're talking about creating an atmosphere that was created in Operation Cast Lead years ago when they went out and killed everything that moved, babies, cats, children, horses, mules, whatever got in the way, they killed it. I know that. I had IDF members tell me those were their orders because they wanted to teach everyone in the region, particularly Hezbollah, who had just handed them a defeat, thank you very much, that they shouldn't mess with the IDF. So they felt like being bloodthirsty across the area of Gaza was what they needed to do. And they did it for about, 21 days or something like that. Now they're doing it wholesale, and they don't seem to even be wanting to stop. When you create that kind of atmosphere at the very top, when you bless these sorts of actions, think My Lai and for the United States in Vietnam, or think some of the atrocities that occurred in Europe during World War II. When you create the leadership environment for this to happen, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen glaringly. And if you create the leadership environment that says, because Eisenhower and others stopped that in Europe, and Nimitz and MacArthur stopped it in the Pacific, and other people stopped it in Vietnam when we were in Vietnam, or tried to stop it. But when your leadership is egging it on, when your leadership says, go for it, kill everything that moves, you create an environment that is no longer recallable. You can't bring those people back from the brink. You have unleashed the devil, and you can't bring him back.
The other thing that was so tragic was this attack on Al-Shifa Hospital. It's amazing how they continue doing this, and nobody is holding them accountable in the United States, in the Biden administration.
That's the question of the day, Nima. Every president for whom I worked or that I worked in the regime of always had red lines with Israel and enforced those red lines, whether it was Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Jimmy Carter. It didn't matter who the president was. My president, George W. Bush, the one I served most closely, they had their red lines, and they said, this will not do. And they stood up for this will not do. Now, George W. Bush didn't have a whole lot of times that he could do that, but when he did, the one time I knew about, he did it forcefully. Biden will not do it. Biden is a different character altogether, and the team around him are different characters altogether. When you listen to John Kirby give the administration's position, you are shocked if you've been around the government like I have for half a century. You've never heard any words like this come out of a supposed spokesman's mouth, let alone a diplomat's mouth. You have never encountered this sort of thing. You're in shock when you sit there listening to him. That's what all of my friends say, and all my colleagues from the military, retired and otherwise. They say the same thing. They can't believe that we're doing what we're doing. And yet, many of them still on active service are going along with it. Some of them are thinking about leaving, but so far, none of my colleagues have left. A few have left, the State Department in particular, as you probably know. A few more are getting ready to leave the State Department, but it's a trickle. But they all pretty much tell me the same thing. They cannot believe that we are doing what we are doing and how we're doing it. They know what the law says. They know what the rules are. They know what you're supposed to use these weapons for, and they know what they can cite you the congressional law that says, if you do this, we do this. If you do this, we do this. We are not doing any of our responsibilities. And they're puzzled by it and appalled by it in some instances.
One of the main goals of these attacks on Gaza was to destroy Hamas during this conflict. How much of that objective has been achieved so far, in your opinion?
Mark my words, if we don't do something to stop him, and I mean something really hard to stop him, he'll take it right on up to September and October doing it and wipe out the elections that Benny Gantz wants, because he doesn't want them. But to answer your question, not successful at all. A few have been taken down. A few key leaders have been taken down. But in terms of the idea, which is what you got to defeat, and the only way you defeat an idea is with a better idea. And Bibi Netanyahu has no better ideas at all. What you're doing is enhancing their capacity for the future. No question about it. You're enhancing, expanding, and developing their future capacity. Because every time you do what you're doing to the hospitals, to the refugees, to the hungry masses, every time you do that, you're putting steel in the fiber of a few more men, a few more 19-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds, and you will come back and you will have to contend with them in another decade or so. They will grow a new army. The same thing we did in Vietnam. We used to sit in South Vietnam and say, wait a minute now. Okay, we've defeated that NVA regiment, North Vietnamese regular regiment. We've defeated that one. They're bled down to nothing. How do they keep coming back? Well, look at it for a few minutes. We were there from 1959 to 1975. They grew 3 or 4 armies in that time because they had sanctuary. They had sanctuary in Laos, in Cambodia, and of course, most of the time in North Vietnam. Hamas has sanctuary all over the Middle East. They can go to Qatar. They can go to Saudi Arabia. They can go to Egypt. They can go to almost any country that hates Israel's guts, which is every country in the Levant. Remember what I said? Remember what Joseph said about Israel needing an enemy desperately 24/7 in order to exist as a Jewish state? Well, that's what they've created. And Hamas is not going away. I'm sorry, Bibi, unless you're going to march over every border in the Levant, march into the Mediterranean, and slaughter every single Arab, whatever they might be and wherever they might be. They're going to come back. Mark my words, I'll be dead, but I'll be looking down or up on you, watching you still fighting Hamas.
Another important country would be Egypt. We know that Sisi has been doing the same thing that Erdogan was trying to do. And
now, he's so broke. He is absolutely broke. Inflation is off the charts. I mean, he's in a bad shape. So, you know, my admiration for the King of Jordan grows every day, that he's able to sustain what he's sustaining. But he is in a trick bag of just gargantuan proportions, mostly created by Bibi Netanyahu. I mean, I suspect if the King of Jordan were allowed to have a duel with Bibi, he would dispatch him. He's in real, what's he sitting on, 1.5 million Palestinians? And, you know, as the old king used to say to us, I've got a Bedouin tribe and a whole bunch of Palestinians. That's a very tenuous situation. And he's in the same sort of boat that Egypt is. He might be a little bit better off economically, but Egypt is really in trouble economically. I was looking at the inflation figures yesterday. They're really bad.
One of the aspects that is so important, I think, for the state of Israel would be how this war is changing the world's public opinion on Israel.
Their solution is their relationship with America. And Joe Biden has given them carte blanche with that relationship. But I go back to Joseph's point. You can be that kind of a state, a Jewish state that is constantly at war, because by the nature of your state, you are going to be constantly at war. You don't like peace. You shun peace. Peace will not keep your state together. You have to have war to keep your state together. Once the United States relationship is gone, and it will go, there's no question about that in my mind, then you're really standing out there on the end of the plank over the big blue ocean. Here's what I said in 2016. Israel will not be a state. You can go back and check it. Israel will not be a state in 20 years. I'm amending that. Israel will not be a state in a decade. Not at its present rate. It is making too many enemies. It is doing too much to injure any kind of reputation that it might have had in the world, certainly in the region. And as you said, even though I know Saudi Arabia and Egypt and all the rest of them, they'll come back like little chickens to the hen house when everything's subsided and, you know, the Gazans are being roughly taken care of, the 20 or 30 of them that are left. But that's not the big issue here. The big issue is the world is looking at this, looking at us, and falling away from the empire's wishes every day by the hundreds of thousands, if not the millions. We have got a world right now that is not only thinking and doing things that are inimical to our interests because we have compelled them to, but now they're strategizing about it in Beijing, in Moscow, in Delhi, in Ankara, in Buenos Aires. All over the world, people are thinking about how to get away from the empire. And if there's an enclave in there or a narrow strip or whatever they can walk down or march down economically, financially, diplomatically, or whatever, they're going to do it. And they're going to do it together eventually, because this is the nature of empire when it gets out of control. Whether it's the Persian Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, doesn't matter. This is the way empires go away. People get fed up with them, and they get fed up with their acolytes like Israel, and they get fed up with what it means for them to live in a world with this empire whose boot heel is on their neck all the time. And pretty soon you wake up, not pretty soon, but in a few years, you're going to wake up, and we're going to be without a monetary system that we can bash people with, sanctions that we can bash people with, they'll be meaningless, or anything else. Now, let me give you some other information. Here we are, involved in two wars that are absolutely not in our vital national security interests, while a Marine group is on an island owned by Taiwan about 50 meters or so from the Chinese mainland. What does that tell you? Would you want to be one of those Marines there on that island? Those Marines are saying to China, look what we're doing. We're right here in your backyard. My God, we're not in your backyard. We're on your front porch. And we are asserting the power of America. Well, let me tell you something. The Army of the United States of America asked Congress to reduce its end strength because it cannot recruit to that end strength and doesn't want to be embarrassed the third year in a row, falling 10, 20, 30% short of recruiting. The propensity of American youth to serve is 9%. The Navy can't sail some of its ships because it doesn't have enough sailors to man them. The Air Force cannot man some of its airplanes and its bases because it doesn't have enough people. The only people actually meeting their recruitment goals, and they're the smallest of the big services, are the Marines, the ones that are on that island. But I wouldn't want to be those Marines on that island, being that statement about our stupidity in Washington. But that's what we're doing today. It is, in a single word, insanity.
It seems that Speaker Johnson finally is getting some sort of agreement with the Biden administration to send more aids to Ukraine.
Pay Zelensky's wages before he goes off into the theater's, curtains. We're just wasting this money, just wasting it. But it's going to get Joe reelected. That's what Joe thinks.
Is that realistic in your opinion?
No. Realistic if we're paying off some of the oligarchs, giving them some money to have to cushion their disastrous lifestyle as they have to accommodate the Russians. And here's another thing about Ukraine. I keep saying this. Look at that line. Look at that battle line. And look at what might happen with that over the next 3, 4, 5, 6 months. Incrementally inching closer and closer and closer, and taking more and more territory. And what's happening is the Russians are moving, not the Russian troops, but the Russian Ukrainians are moving with it. And they're just staying right ahead of the line. And as soon as the Russians stop and they decide, somebody gets a ceasefire going and we get a peace solution, which has got to happen someday, they're going back into their homes. But the Ukrainians that are being pushed out, they're going away. And they're not going to Kyiv. They're going other places. The Poles are getting tired of it. Others are getting tired of it. They're leaving. And they don't want to get drafted. The draft now is pretty draconian and of all ages. What's the future for Ukraine? And why is anybody not talking about talking? Why aren't they talking about a negotiated ceasefire? At least stop this inexorable movement of the Russian line. Let's have a ceasefire. Let's have a demilitarized zone. Maybe put some UN forces in there. If they've got any, they're all over the world already. And let's negotiate before you lose half your country, Mr. Zelensky. This is nonsense. It's worse than nonsense. As I said, it's insanity.
It seems to me that at the end of the day, without having this war in Ukraine, he cannot survive.
It really doesn't matter who you are or what your war-making skills are or your leadership skills are. Think for a moment of one of the most brilliant military geniuses in the last 500 years, Napoleon Bonaparte. And think about his defeat and then his coming back and raising his armies again and going on and starting it all over again and finally meeting his métier, if you will, at Waterloo. But that was even a close run battle. People don't give up who get in these sorts of situations. The only thing that forces them to give up eventually is going into the bunker in Berlin and taking a poison pill, or getting hung by a war crimes trial, or in some cases, your own people seeing the bloodshed, seeing the sacrifice, seeing the treasure going, stop you. Usually that means you get forced out and somebody else comes in to do the peacemaking. That's what's going to happen with Zelensky.
In the mainstream media, they're talking about the possibility of having a military coup in Ukraine. How possible is that, in your opinion? How likely is that?
I wouldn't want to be the military officer bringing it about unless I were very assured that I had a significant number of my following, my military following, professional military following, that was going to follow me into immediate peace talks and a ceasefire and then immediate peace talks. I'm not sure any commander in the Ukrainian military, and I'm a little bit out of my writ here because I don't know any of them personally now. I'm not sure that they can call on that kind of following so that they would be assured that they wouldn't announce it on Monday and get shot on Monday night. Because Zelensky still has quite an apparatus, as do other people who are making money off this war. They want that money to come out of Congress. They want that money to come to Ukraine because it's going to go in their pockets. What doesn't go in U.S. contractors' pockets is going to go in their pockets. So it's a dicey thing to do that sort of thing. And I wouldn't expect that unless he was very confident, or, I don't know, very confident that they had a significant following that could protect them at least for the first 36 hours until they got something moving, some kind of momentum going, would risk it. It takes a lot of courage to do something like that. It takes a lot of courage, especially if you're sincere. And I wouldn't want to see it happen if it weren't someone who was sincere and had Ukraine's best interests at his heart.
A good portion of this $61 billion that they're going to send to Ukraine would come back to the pocket of military-industrial complex.
Of course.
And
I would guess.
The other portion would go to the Zelensky's office. Is that going to affect the battlefield for Ukraine?
Not at all, probably. Not at all. And in fact, I dare say the frontline Ukrainian soldier will only in rare instances even know that any money's arrived.
We know that Emmanuel Macron wanted to send 2,000 soldiers to Ukraine. An article in Bloomberg criticizing this type of opinion. European leaders were against this type of decision. Why he's insisting on this policy? Do you think is that a political gain for him and his party? Is he really thinking that is it going to change anything on the battlefield in favor of Ukrainians?
You're talking about things that I was talking about in 2016 that I was foreseeing in terms of NATO's dissolution and falling apart, and they're beginning to happen now. Let's just look at it for a moment. Well, let's take the polls, recent polls that I saw. Of the 26 or so leaders that you might call the Western leaders in NATO, North America, the lowest approval ratings since polling of those 26 leaders, including Biden. Then you look over at the other page that tells you their approval ratings. And sometimes these things don't line up very well, but they line up pretty well here. Their approval ratings are extremely low and their disapproval ratings are extremely high. That tells you something. It tells you that operative in all of these countries now, and France in particular, is domestic politics, because their ratings are so low and they don't want to lose power. They don't want their party to lose power. They don't want to lose power personally. So that's one of the most deleterious, negative aspects of democracy at war, is that national security decisions, vital decisions, get made for domestic political reasons. Now let's look at France in particular. France is losing its empire in Africa. It's falling apart. From Cote d'Ivoire all the way up to Niger, it's falling apart. They're being kicked out, as are we. Thank God. I wish they'd kick everybody in the United States that has a uniform on out of Africa. It's not a military domain. Look at what's happening in East Africa right now. You got 9 million refugees from Sudan. You got 500,000 right now just went into Chad, went into Chad. Now, of that 9 million, and some of those that just went into Chad, I'm sure will join, they're going up through war-torn Libya. And they're getting on boats and they're going into Europe. Wait until we see the after effects of this. The Italians aren't able to kill them all, or the Greeks aren't able to kill them all. So we've got a huge mess there too. Part of that is because it's finally leaving the age of colonization and colonialism. And the French are being kicked out. The U.S. is being kicked out. Everybody's being kicked out of Africa. So Macron is looking at losing what is left, the vestiges of any French empire that still existed. And at the same time, really low poll rate. He's going to do whatever he can to try and bring his poll ratings back up and look like the strong man of Europe. It isn't going to work. At worst, it's going to get Putin to the point where he feels like NATO might be playing in Ukraine, and that's bad. And at best for Macron, it's not going to work. Macron's entire military could go into Ukraine and be ground up in 6 weeks. And it goes for Britain's military too. These are boutique militaries, Nima, boutique militaries. They're not warfighting militaries, which is one reason why when we went into the Balkans, we had very few of them come with us. And other places where we went to war and begged NATO to come in, we only had various contingents of them, really small in some cases. Like in the Red Sea, we had one that had four of their military actually joined us in the Red Sea. Well, we had the same thing in Iraq. We had the same thing in Afghanistan until things calmed down a little bit. And then the Germans did some police action and such. But basically, we have never had much of NATO join us. And one of the reasons, formidable reasons, political reasons, of course, are heavy too, but one of the big mechanical reasons, if you will, is they don't have much. They don't have much at all. They depend on the United States. They depend on Turkey. And to a certain extent, for a long time there, they depended on Germany, even when it was in Bonn and not Berlin, because Germany had this mystique about it and a mystique about its military. But there's just not much fighting power there.
Larry, there is an article in Financial Times. It says wars in Ukraine and Middle East boost orders at German defense supplier. It simply says that Germany is benefiting from the war in Ukraine, from the wars in Ukraine and Gaza. Do you think they're trying to push Germany's economy? They're trying to shift Germany's economy from civilian technologies to military technologies?
I think there are some people in almost every NATO country, more in some than others, who would like to do that because they've seen what the United States did with that. And they've seen what the United States military, industrial, congressional, think tank, university complex has done to the rest of the world. But they have also seen the incredible profits it's generated. I mean, they don't pay the CEO of Lockheed Martin $12 to $20 million and then stock options and bonuses and everything for nothing. This is all just raked off the top of these massive contracts that Lockheed and others now have with the U.S. military, and for that matter, other countries too. So they're looking at that and thinking, oh man, I'd like a little bit of that for my counter. I'd like a little bit of that in my cash register. But it's a small group in each one of the countries. It's larger in some than others. France, for example, is pretty substantial. And I suspect in Germany it's growing because they're looking for alternatives. They've lost so much. And that's a dangerous happening too. It's a danger. What are we going to do? Have a global arms race with everybody seeing who can outrun the other guy, making death weapons? Dangerous development, very, very dangerous development. We're doing that with nuclear weapons right now. We're doing it with nuclear weapons. Very dangerous development there. Look at the Sentinel ballistic missile, the new ballistic missile for the United States. Look at the Columbia-class submarine for the United States. Cost overruns out the yin-yang, way beyond schedule. This is going to be the most expensive submarine in human history. This is going to be the most expensive bomber for the Air Force, most expensive ballistic missile. All of these things are going to cost trillions of dollars. And other countries, look at that and salivate and say, boy, I'd like a little bit of that. That's not a good development.
The leader of AfD is Alternative for Germany. He recently was talking about starting this connection, these pipelines, because one of these pipelines between Russia and Germany can still work for them.
Right.
Do you think that this party has a chance in the future in Germany?
I'm not sure that sort of idea will resonate with other Germans. Alternative for Deutschland actually is kind of based in East Germany, so you can take your hints from that. But I think eventually there will be, the kind of things the Germans do. They'll consolidate 3 or 4 of the parties, and then someone will be the prime minister. Maybe you got the most, or the chancellor. Maybe you got the most votes, whatever. But they're going to have a hard time dealing with the energy situation, period. Not opening that other pipeline, and indeed getting to work restoring the others if it's possible, doesn't make any sense at all, except as you accept the ultimate and almost overwhelming hegemony of America over your energy situation, which I can't imagine them doing. And this is another reason why I say NATO is going to fall apart, because I can't imagine that we blew up that pipeline to help us reestablish our economic hegemony over Europe, period. That's the reason we did it. Maybe it had some ancillary purposes with regard to Ukraine and our hatred of Moscow and Putin in particular, but we really did it to reestablish our hegemony over Europe, whose energy is being bought by the engine of Europe right now, Germany. Ours, more expensive, more unclean in terms of burning it, but that's what's happened. We lost the East Coast Pipeline, which was what? The East Coast Pipeline was a $12 billion pipeline. My energy company, Dominion Energy here in Virginia, invested in and lost. And why did they lose it? Basically because the CEO was stupid enough to tell the Congress of the United States that all of its first years of production, that was about 12 years, was going to Europe, not to the United States. And Congress said, are you kidding me? No, you're not. So for environmental reasons on the one hand, and those reasons majorly on the other hand, Congress killed it. My energy company's trying to recover now. But that was part of establishing our hegemony over Europe. Couldn't do it. So what do? We take out the Russian pipeline, and it becomes mandatory that we ship it over there. I mean, sometimes I wonder why people don't wake up to what we're doing.
Thank you so much, Larry, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. See you soon.
Mearsheimer said the other day that he thought Israel was acting insanely. I like John. I usually agree with John. But I wanted to say, John, insanely only to you, not to Bibi. And that's the key. That's the key. If you were in charge of Israel, John, fine, but Bibi's in charge. And this is not insane for him to be doing this. He wants to stay out of jail and he wants to get reelected or stay in power.